Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the Green Party on the Biosecurity Law Reform Bill. The Green Party strongly supports the statement in the explanatory note to this bill, and I quote, "Biosecurity is critical to New Zealand's prosperity and way of life. More than any other developed country, New Zealand depends on the success of its primary industries and the biosecurity system that underpins them. The biosecurity system also protects the native plants and animals and other resources that are taonga to Māori and precious to all New Zealanders." End quote. We are now used to hearing about biosecurity incursions into New Zealand on a pretty regular basis. PSA, Varroa, Dirimo, Kauri dieback disease, Undaria, painted apple moth, southern salt marsh mosquito and so on. The incursions we have already had have cost us hugely, but these are nothing compared to some of the risks that we need to guard against. Foot and mouth disease, for example, or various fruit flies, as Horticulture New Zealand warned yesterday. In the face of these major threats, there is no doubt that our old Biosecurity Act was no longer fit for purpose, and the Green Party welcomes this attempt to bring it up to speed. We support most of the provisions of the bill. The Biosecurity Information Database and the National Policy Direction from the Minister are, for example, good common sense measures. We particularly welcome the extension of our biosecurity regime to our full exclusive economic zone, consistent with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and ratification of the International Convention for Ship Ballast Water. One of the limitations of our existing unsophisticated biosecurity measures is that we worry most about what we can see. My colleague Kevin Haigh has often spoken in the House about the near-complete absence of adequate measures for responding to risks from microscopic organisms. The same principle applies to places that we don't usually see, such as remote terrestrial areas, underwater environments and distant from our shores. We have mixed feelings and look forward to hearing the submissions about the provisions for distributed responsibility for biosecurity management. A more cooperative approach has some potential to extend the biosecurity net and improve outcomes, but it also has the potential to blur lines of responsibility and carries many of the conflict of interest risks of self-policing. The bill also codifies the government's current approach of targeted risk management, and in some ways this is the nub of the bill. With an inevitably limited budget and potentially uncapped risk, targeting resources to the highest risks is the only approach to take. In 2009, about 104 loaded incoming shipping containers were checked for biosecurity risks each day. That's about 9% of those coming into the country, leaving around 386,850 shipping containers unchecked over the course of a year. Well, maybe it's the highest risk 9% that are checked. It certainly should be. But that's a huge amount of uncontrolled risk. It's also essential, but absent from the bill, that we act to minimise risk by minimising the import of goods that pose risk. Again, as the bill's explanatory note says, and I quote, "Globalisation and changes in transport technologies have resulted in greater and more rapid trade and travel, and the development of new trade and travel routes. While this is positive for New Zealand's economy, it exposes us to greater and more complex biosecurity risk." The Green Party says that this is an unacceptable approach. The government proposes no measures at all to try to reduce, let alone minimise, the biosecurity risk. In fact, it's even worse than this. The bill explicitly makes biosecurity law subject to the limitations of international trade agreements. That's in Section 100G5E. Section 100G5E talks about imposing levies for the purposes of having pest management plans. Pest management plans are the plans for the eradication or management of pests. These can either be national or regional. The government has given itself the power to impose a levy for the purpose of funding a pest management plan, but it has made it explicitly clear that you can't actually introduce such a levy if it is in breach of our international trade agreements. This means that the government's free trade agenda not only poses increasing risk that we need to try to deal with because of ever-increasing volumes of imports, all of which could carry pest species, but also will compromise New Zealand's ability to respond to that risk in our own domestic biosecurity law. That means that despite the good things in the bill that this bill would achieve, the surrender of our biosecurity sovereignty that the government proposes means we cannot possibly support it. The increasing trade volumes and therefore biosecurity risk associated with free trade agreements is well known and will be looked back on as a kind of collective madness. Some of what our free trade agreement with China has already delivered is 77% of imported shoes containing fungi, bacteria and plant material, and garlic infested with fungi. We now have free trade agreements with countries where foot and mouth disease is endemic. This bill proposes to limit our ability to take all possible steps to combat the inevitably increasing risk from those countries. A foot and mouth incursion could cost 20,000 jobs and reduce GDP by $10 billion over 2 years. The stakes are very high indeed, and we need to face them without a hand tied behind our backs. This is not the first area where the government's headlong rush to embrace free trade agreements has been identified as posing an erosion of New Zealand's sovereignty by limiting our ability to determine domestic law. I mean, if you just think about the current TPP negotiations, which include Malaysia. Malaysia has foot and mouth disease. We import PKE, palm kernel expeller, from Malaysia currently in huge quantities, upwards of many hundreds of thousands of tonnes of PKE comes in from Malaysia. Foot and mouth disease can be dormant in soil, can be carried in soil. The PKE in Malaysia sits on the ground and then is scooped up with large amounts of soil before it is loaded and shipped and sent to New Zealand. So our exposure to foot and mouth via PKE is quite real and is actually a genuine biosecurity risk. However, what this bill says is that New Zealand can't introduce levies to manage these kind of risks if they breach our free trade agreements. What this bill says is that whatever we sign up to in the TPP will restrict our own ability to pass sovereign domestic biosecurity law. The Green Party will participate constructively in the Select Committee process to help improve the bill and looks forward to hearing the submissions from the New Zealand public. But we tell the House now that we will not support a bill that compromises New Zealand's ability to do everything possible to protect this country from biosecurity risks and threats, and neither should any other party. The New Zealand that would be the logical result of this bill's preparedness to compromise biosecurity in the interests of free trade agreements is one of globalised pests, diminished biodiversity and the faded, degraded greyness of the globally standard environment, not our future.